Hi and welcome to the channel. Today we will build another SFF PC, which is the S400. It's just S400. Some call it Shiny Snake, some call it Flashscale, some call it KXRORS, whatever that means. But the box was really quiet about it as there was no branding whatsoever. I came to notice this case as there were commenters on the channel to check this case out. It was interesting but I was not able to find it immediately. I then finally found it last September in JHKJ Tech in Shopee. For Filipinos, it is also now available in Lazada in the same shop. As for compatibility, it comes in black and white color, up to 3 2.5-inch drives or one 3.5-inch drive, but that will limit your GPU to 225mm. ITX motherboard, up to 3.2 slots expansion. It has power cable at the back, USB 3 or USB 3 with USB-C. As for my case, I only have the USB 3, SFX and SFX LPSU, 65mm cooler. As for the GPU, its written spec is 335 by 154 by 65mm. Again, if you have a 3.5-inch drive, GPU is only up to 225 by 154 by 65mm. And if you have a 120mm water cooler, GPU is only up to 200 by 154 by 65mm. Dimensions is 340 by 155 by 255mm or around 10.8 liters. By the way, I also found an English spec in Lazada and Shopee. Unwritten in this chart is that it can also cater for 2 slim 120mm fans at the top and 1 slim 92mm fan at the bottom. Again, this is pretty much comparable to the G1 SE2 but also with Lian Li A4H2O based on size and PC Cooler i100-2 based on raw price. Anyway, here's the side-by-side comparison of each spec. As for the price, the S400 will cost you around 7,900 pesos, including a PCIe Gen 4 riser. This is around 1,000 pesos cheaper than the Lian Li A4H2O, though if you have a riser already, you can buy the case for 5,800 pesos, which is not bad. Anyway, this is the GPU side of the case. In this side, you can see the USB 3 and power switch. It has a handle, which is nice. On the other side, it only has a mesh panel. The front is plain, and at the back, you'd see a cutout for the motherboard and for a 3-slot GPU. You can also see the power port here. To remove the side panels, use a screwdriver, not a tool-less design, which is fine. Inside is an accessory box, a magnetic dust filter which you can slap at the bottom panel, and a very basic but more or less what you need manual. There's a written specs at the back of the manual, and notice that the graphics card width differs by 14mm. As for the accessories, it has zip ties and a bunch of screws. That's it. Moving on with the build, unscrew the fan brackets on each side, screw the fans to the fan bracket, screw back the fan bracket to the case. Before I proceed, I just want to highlight that like Cooler Master NR200P, they bundled up the power switch and power LED for easy installation. Based on the steps provided, it's time to install the riser. However, I usually don't install this just yet, but I do position it properly first. As for the components, I'll be using the usual B550i Aorus Pro AX as the motherboard and its processor, which I pre-installed the Ryzen 7 5800X. RAM is a Kingston Fury non-RGB 32GB 3200MHz CL16 RAM. Remove the AM4 mounting clips. I also plugged in the 8-pin power connector already as it might be difficult to reach later. Put in ample amount of thermal paste. If you're wondering why there's a decent amount of thermal paste already, do watch out till the end of this video. Remove the backplate. As for the cooler, I used the Alpenfohn Blackridge cooler in overclocking slim mode for a total of 62mm height. Put the cooler on top of the CPU. Together with the cooler, do an acrobatic flip of the motherboard. Screw the cooler to the motherboard. Install the fan clips to the cooler. Clip the fan to the cooler. And then plug the fan to the fan header. Install the motherboard to the case. Now it's time to plug the riser to the motherboard. Plug a Y splitter to the motherboard and plug the fans to the Y splitter. Next is to tackle the PSU. First is to remove the PSU bracket, which is just screwed by 2 screws. As for the PSU, I'll be using the FSP Dagger Pro 850 watts SFX Gold power supply. Screw the PSU to the PSU bracket, turn on the PSU. Plug the power extension cable. Since my PSU is modular, plug the cables to the PSU. Install the PSU bracket to the case. Plug the USB 3 and front panel switch. Plug the 24-pin power connector. To tackle the GPU, remove the PCIe covers. As for the GPU, I'll be using an Asus ROG Strix RTX 3070. Before I installed it, I plugged the GPU to the riser and also plugged the PCIe power connectors as you'd have no chance later on. In this build, I only struggled on this part as the power connectors are touching the fan, which would hinder its rotation. I put most of the cables to the front of the case and the last one to the side of the case. It was also tough to screw the riser now as the metal down below hinders the screwdriver. Anyway, screw the GPU to the case and then notice that the PCIe connectors loosened up and was now touching the fan. I used a masking tape for now to fix this. Install the PCIe cover and close the side panels. As for post-build comments, I was not able to post as the riser was plugged out of the motherboard. I simply plugged it back and retested. For thermal benchmark, I tested it in 3 cooling configuration, 1 exhaust fan at the top only. In this scenario, you have a tall GPU that can't fit the power connectors. 2 exhaust fans at the top, which I'd call as the normal configuration. Triple fan config, which means 2 exhaust fans at the top and 1 intake fan at the bottom. And this is the maximum fan capacity of the case. I also tested it with 2 GPUs, RTX 3070 since it's the biggest, hottest GPU that I have, and the RTX 3060 as a comparison with the PC Cooler i100-2. As for the temps while benchmarking Cinebench R23 for 30 minutes, the CPU temps hovered at 90 degrees Celsius for all configurations, which is expected. As for the CPU temps while benchmarking FF15 for 30 minutes, with the RTX 3060, the single fan config was 2 degrees Celsius hotter than the dual fan and triple fan configs. With the RTX 3070, the single fan config was 3 degrees Celsius hotter than the dual fan and triple fan configs. Also notice that the dual fan and triple fan config have insignificant differences. As compared with PC Cooler i100-2, the S400 in dual and triple fan config isn't much different in CPU temperature. However, do note that the single fan config is 2 degrees Celsius hotter. Against Lianli A4H2O, the S400 was 1 to 2 degrees Celsius hotter. However, do note that the A4H2O used a better CPU cooler since it was compatible. As for the G1 SE2, it was 2 degrees Celsius hotter than the hottest S400 configuration. As for the GPU temps, the 3070 in dual and triple fan config were cooler by 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to its single fan configuration, while the RTX 3060 in dual and triple fan config were 2 degrees Celsius cooler as compared to its single fan config. As compared with the Mushroom S, the GPU temps were actually good, and of course, GPU temp is already a known weakness for the PC Cooler i100-2. With RTX 3070, you can see that it can beat some of the mainstream cases. As for the hotspot temps, it is pretty much the same story and there's nothing worth noting. This is the same with the fan speed, nothing worth noting. Overall, the temps were actually decent, especially in dual fan config. As for the cons of this case, first is actually the position of the switch and USB. Personally, I'd want this to be in the front but still at the bottom part. The reason is that I have fat fingers and I find it hard to reach the riser's lock to unlock the GPU. It also made it difficult for me to screw the riser. Next is the confusing GPU compatibility between the online seller's page and the one stated in the manual. This case can have different GPU compatibility with and without top fans, which would ideally be stated as well. There was also no website to check, so this is pretty much another D21 Pro. On the side, I recently noticed that the D21 Pro has changed its compatible top fan, and therefore, our mileage may vary with this S400. Since there is no branding, there is less accountability other than the retailer's words. As for the pros of this case, they basically fixed everything that I don't like in PC Cooler i100-2 and Geek G1 SE2. Namely, good PSU mount, the cables were properly placed such as the front panel to be at the bottom while the power cable is at the motherboard side. This resulted to a really good GPU compatibility with reasonable height restrictions. They used an optimized mesh design for cooling as well, and it has true fan compatibility which made the temps really good. They also bundled the front panel switches which made the build experience even better. As for my suggestions to buyers, go for the dual fan config as the triple fan config will not yield significant temperature performance gains. Also, buy a fan grill to ensure that the cables will not touch the GPU. Again, be careful if you're going to plug a GPU with 12 VH power as it will need some slack before bending. As for the components to choose, I'd say get a motherboard that is compatible with IS-55 as IS-55 is the best cooler that can fit this case. Overall, I'd choose this if you're considering either the Lianli A4H2O, Geek G1 SE2, or even the PC Cooler i100 Pro Mesh and i100-2. It's definitely better or at least at par in terms of cooling, and the experience in PC build was seamless. This is the easiest build that I've done for a while. As compared to the NR200P, which if you account for the riser and two fans at the top, is 3,000 pesos cheaper than S400, personally, I'd go for NR200P and sacrifice the size. However, it's not wrong if you consider S400 for the looks and size, which is of course valid for SFF builds. Anyway, that's it for this video. Do comment down below on what you think of this case. Thanks for watching. Do like or dislike and subscribe for more unboxing, SFF builds, and benchmarks. Bye! So actually, I installed the wrong cooler at first. I was planning to install an AXP120-X67. I thought that it could fit the case. In my mind, it was not 67mm, but rather 62mm for some reason. I even strategized on how to place the cooler mount properly. I removed two fan clips at the top and installed the cooler's bracket so that the backplate will not be loose. When I placed the motherboard inside the case, I was actually complaining at first, why does the case's edges hinders the cooler? I was able to close the side panels but didn't bother to try screwing the motherboard to the case. And that's the reason why there's already a nicely distributed thermal paste. I made a mistake and already mounted a bigger cooler but corrected it afterwards.